Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for our discussion about superintendent's role in leading district-wide implementation of social and emotional learning. We're excited to bring you this webinar in partnership with AASA, the School Superintendents Association. We are really looking forward to hearing from all of our presenters, but before we begin, I'll review just a few quick housekeeping items with you. I'm sure you're all going to have many questions throughout the presentation, and we are going to leave some time to take as many of them as possible. We're going to hold the Q&A at the end once we've gotten through all of the content from our presenters. To ask a question, you can type your question into the questions box in your control panel, and I will put it in the queue to be answered during the Q&A period. If your question is specifically for one of our panelists, please include his or her name along with your question so that I'm sure to address it to the right person when we get to that Q&A portion. If you experience any technical difficulties during the webinar, you can use that same questions feature to get my attention, and I'll do my best to resolve the problem for you. One of the main issues that does happen, unfortunately, is sometimes a lag with the audio keeping up with the slides, and that's usually just because of a weaker or ebb and flow of your internet bandwidth. One thing you can do is to disconnect from the computer audio and then dial in with the phone number that's shown on your control panel. And that usually resolves any kind of audio issues. We are going to show a video here in just a few minutes, and sometimes the audio on that can be a little bit difficult to hear, basically, but we will send you a link to that YouTube video if you do have trouble hearing it. It's about 3 minutes, so just stick with us if it's not crystal clear for you. We will be sending you a recording of the webinar, and we'll share that with you tomorrow. So keep an eye on your email inbox for information on how to access both the recording and the slide deck. So we are going to get started, and I am pleased to introduce our two superintendents that are with us today, along with the Director of Field Learning from CASEL. So we'll be hearing shortly from Sheldon Berman, who is currently Superintendent of Andover Public Schools in Massachusetts. Sheldon has been a teacher, president of a nonprofit organization, and superintendent throughout his distinguished 40-year career. He has previously served as superintendent of the Eugene School District in Eugene, Oregon, Jefferson County Public Schools in Louisville, Kentucky, and Hudson, Massachusetts Public Schools. He serves on the CAST Board of Directors and is co-chair of AASA's SEL Cohort Advisory Board. So Sheldon is joined today by Janet Robinson, who is also co-chair of AASA's SEL Cohort Advisory Board and currently superintendent of Stratford Public Schools in Connecticut. Janet spent many years as an educational consultant in districts throughout the country and eventually worked as a deputy executive director at Cooperative Educational Services in Trumbull and was superintendent of schools in Preston, Derby, and Newtown before joining the Stratford schools. Justina Schlund is also with us today. Excuse me, Justina. Justina oversees CASEL's efforts to translate essential learning from the field into resources and professional development that support systemic SEL implementation. Prior to joining CASEL, Justina was the executive director of Chicago Public Schools Office of Social and Emotional Learning, where she led district-wide improvement strategies to foster supportive learning environments that promote the social and emotional development of all students. So we are going to get started today with Justina, and I will go ahead and hand things over to her.
Great, thank you so much, Emily, and I'm pleased to be here, and thank you all for joining us. Through our work at CASEL, we've been partnering and examining the role of superintendents for a while. We've been looking at how do you implement high quality systemic SEL and really thinking about how superintendents play such a critical role. Meanwhile, at CASEL, we have learned that at AASA, the School Superintendents Association, they have also identified SEL as a top priority and developed an SEL cohort, which is led by Dr. Berman and Dr. Robinson, who are on today's webinar with us. So our two organizations, CASEL and AASA, have decided to come together and really examine and share what are the particular actions that superintendents can take to accelerate and sustain SEL implementation. So that's what we're doing here today. We've been collaborating over the past year really to develop a superintendent's toolkit for SEL, which is called the district-wide SEL Essentials for Superintendents. And that's been informed and workshopped with superintendents across the country in both AASA and CASEL's networks. So we're excited to share that with you today. Next. Great. So to get us started, we thought we'd share some of the messages on SEL directly from superintendents themselves. You can also find this video. We're going to play it here, but you can also find this video if you want to go back to it at our website at castle.org. And as you watch this video, I would really love for you to begin to reflect on what role do you think superintendents play in SEL implementation? And as a superintendent or district leader, or from whatever role that you're sitting in, what is your message about SEL?
All right, so I'm going to switch over to YouTube now, and then we'll take a look at the video.
I'm a parent, which I think is the most important way that I can look at the work, the decisions that I make, the programs that we implement. I'm always thinking about other people's children, but I'm also thinking about my children and what's best for them.
I could have done a lot of other things. I chose to teach because I love kids.
Social emotional learning is essential.
It's the tools that kids need to be resilient, to be problem solvers, to be these deliberate thinkers that we want them to be good people.
You gotta be able to work collaboratively. You have to make good decisions. You have to understand your surroundings and your awareness of yourself and others.
It's really a set of competencies that help you manage relationships and solve problems. I would argue that social emotional learning is absolutely essential to getting to the rigor of content that those who would say we should focus on reading and math really want us to get to.
We have Tesla, Panasonic, we have all these organizations. We work with them and say, what are the skill sets you think our students should have as they exit? And while they talk about the academics, they also talk about these other essential qualities they need in an individual, and those lends itself to the work that we're doing around SEL.
Over the last 5 years, our expulsions have been cut in half.
We were suspending about 13,000 days of out-of-school suspension. We were 10 times the average for any school district in Ohio. And within that first year alone, we were able to reduce our out-of-school suspensions by 55%.
When we started this work, we had a graduation rate of 62%. Last year, we put up a record-breaking 84%.
We would not be able to talk about the successes that we've made as a district if we had not both solved for some of the academic challenges as well as some of the social challenges that our students face. Relationships are the entry point to learning, so you really have to create those conditions for kids to feel connected to you as the teacher or any adult that's there, as well as other children. It can't just be about academics. If students don't feel safe, they're not going to be able to access the curriculum that we're putting in front of them.
Every child needs to have somebody they connect with. They have to have a partner within that school.
And so at every level, the intentionality to really focus on how you're getting all those relationships to be in alignment, it's so important to create fertile soil for students to thrive and to be able to learn. We have a huge challenge in restoring public trust. And I think the work that we're doing around social emotional learning is getting at that.
It's meaningful, it is powerful. When you can look at students saying, well, there's a reason why I need to be in school instead of ditching class. There's a reason why I need to be able to talk about how I feel or how I engage.
And that's what we're looking at, diving deeply into social emotional learning. And CASEL is going to be a huge part of our success in the coming years.
All right, so we'll go back to the PowerPoint now, and I will in just a moment send out by chat that YouTube link so that you've got it in case it didn't come through as clearly as you would have liked.
Great, thanks, Emily. If you'll go to the next slide, before we dive into the toolkit, we really wanted to make sure that we begin and ground this work in our broader mission around SEL and making SEL a fundamental part of pre-K through 12th grade education. So as many of you may know, CASEL has defined SEL as the process through which both children and adults acquire and apply the knowledge and attitudes and skills really to be successful, to navigate their schools and workplaces, and really to be caring and contributing members of their families and communities. And perhaps the most familiar part of our definition are the 5 core social emotional competencies, which you see at the center of this circle on the right. And these competencies involve, in orange, how you understand yourself, your emotions, and your identity, as well as how you manage those emotions or express your agency. And in green, how you understand others, how you take on different perspectives and express empathy and build relationships across differences. And in yellow, how you might set and work toward goals, how you make decisions that take into account different needs, how you might assess and address inequities. But these competencies aren't developed in a vacuum, but through the interactions and the relationships that we have as we move through whatever ecosystem that we're in. So for children, this is represented by the blue rings around this circle. So it means that their social emotional development is shaped as they experience how their classrooms, their schools, their homes, and their communities, as well as the broader social or historical or political climate that we're in. And so at CASEL, we refer to this as systemic SEL, meaning that SEL is intentionally cultivated by paying attention to this entire ecosystem. So go to the next slide. Over the last 25 years, CASEL's developed a theory of action for systemic SEL implementation that's based both on research as well as the practical experiences of our deep district partnerships. So if you start at the right of our theory of action, you'll see that these are the outcomes that districts and schools may be striving toward and that research shows a result of high quality SEL implementation. This includes short-term outcomes such as improvements in classroom and school climate, as well as intermediate outcomes such as positive behaviors, fewer conduct problems, greater academic achievement. It also includes long-term outcomes like high school graduation rates, college and career readiness, as well as long-term impacts on mental health and how I'm engaged as a community member. And in order to achieve these outcomes, we already discussed on the previous slide that we need to pay attention to all the ways that students and adults develop these competencies throughout their ecosystems. But the big question that we've been getting here at CASEL over the last few years is, so how do we do this work in districts and schools? And so we've identified 4 core areas of implementation that help to create a systems-wide kind of focus, the structures and the culture that support SEL. And you'll see these on the far left. And Emily, if you'll go to the next slide, we'll look at these a little bit more closely. So these begin with building the foundational support and plan for SEL. If you'll click again, this aligns your vision, your priorities, your plans, your communications, and resources towards supporting SEL. This also includes how you strengthen adult SEL, which we found is really critical for supporting students. If you're going to do this work for students, we've learned over and over in our district work that you need to pay attention to what the adults are doing, how they're interacting with each other, what the climate and culture looks like, and how prepared they feel to implement SEL. It, of course, includes at the core of this how we're integrating SEL into students' daily experience in schools, including during academic lessons, explicit programs, through discipline practices, through out-of-school time partnerships, really through everything that we're doing that touches and influences students. And lastly, this includes how you engage in continuous improvement throughout all of implementation so that we're doing all of the work grounded in data and science. If you go to the next slide, our theory of action has been shared already in many of our resources, including our District Resource Center, which is a library of a lot of the artifacts, the resources and tools we've collected from districts nationwide. We also have resources specifically at the school level in our CASEL Guide to School-Wide SEL that has tools and guidance for school teams that are leading systemic SEL implementation, as well as at the state level. But really, as we were developing out these resources, we saw the importance of the superintendent's role, and we saw that there was a gap specifically in supporting what should a superintendent do from their level to really push SEL forward in a district. And so this brings us on our next slide, through our collaboration with AASA, we've identified 10 high leverage actions that we believe all superintendents should take to promote, to accelerate, to sustain SEL. And the toolkit that we just released, which you can find at that green link at the bottom of this slide, it's at drc.castle.org/superintendent. You can download your own copy. This toolkit is structured around these 10 actions, which align to the theory of action that I shared on the previous slides. So I'm going to give a quick overview right now of these actions, but then I'm going to turn it over to the superintendents, but really the experts in this, to give you a deeper perspective of how these actions play out in school districts. So these actions for superintendents include those that set up the foundation for SEL. So a huge part of the superintendent's role we've seen is really laying the groundwork for SEL to flourish. So this includes building a foundation of support among key stakeholders, such as the school board. It includes working with stakeholders to develop a shared vision for SEL so that everyone knows what we're working towards, communicating consistently about SEL as a top district priority, allocating resources to support SEL, and organizing district teams and departments in a way that promotes the integration of SEL across key priorities, such as academics and equity. And we've heard that this kind of district organization piece is really a crucial step for a lot of districts, for a lot of district superintendents to be thinking about. This also includes, if you look at the right-hand side, the first two, these are actions specifically around adult SEL, which is how superintendents strengthen their own knowledge and expertise about what SEL looks like within classrooms and schools, and how they're modeling and leading the type of culture that promote adult SEL. The next group of actions are really around how to create alignment in the way that we promote SEL for students. So we heard loudly and clearly from superintendents as we were developing this resource that we need to align district policies, particularly policies that really come in close contact with SEL, such as discipline policies. We really need to create that alignment to be able to support SEL implementation, as well as creating authentic family and community partnerships that both align and promote SEL. And lastly, while we've woven considerations of how SEL can be a lever for equity throughout all of the actions, we think it's especially important that the superintendent is driving towards equitable outcomes, which means that they've created a culture of continuous improvement that looks closely at how students of all backgrounds experience schools and classrooms and are supported in their academic, social, and emotional development. So that was kind of the quick 2-minute overview of that. Again, you can find the full toolkit at that link. But right now, I'm really excited to turn it over to Dr. Sheldon Berman, who's really been one of the pioneers and leaders in SEL implementation nationwide, to share a little bit about how this has looked in his school district. Dr. Berman?
Thank you, Justina. And welcome everybody to this webinar. It's exciting to see that there are so many participants and so many interested in pursuing social emotional learning. I've pursued social emotional learning in 4 districts and learned a lot of lessons. And I think the first and primary lesson is that for the superintendent and district leaders, as well as school leaders, is that we need a vision and we need policy support to carry that forward. Next slide. In Andover and in each of the districts I've been in, we've articulated a way of defining our mission that is inclusive of social emotional learning. So the mission in Andover, which stems out of a theory of action that we have articulated, is that we will provide every student with opportunities and support to demonstrate growth in foundational content and skills, communicate effectively, think critically, problem solve creatively, work collaboratively, and evaluate objectively, be self-directed and persevering agents of their own learning. And then the core, and which is what I've have in bold on the slide, is that demonstrate cultural awareness and appreciation of self, empathy towards others, and a sense of responsibility and commitment to civic engagement. Part of how we've realized that is to look at how are we personalizing education, and we have been working extensively in the arena of personalization. So next slide. The image of what we how we communicate personalization is that we've actually seen 3 arenas for that work. We want to personalize the environment of our schools, and we're doing that through social emotional learning. We want to personalize access to the curriculum, and we're doing that through universal design for learning. And we want to personalize learning itself through authentic learning experiences. And then our accountability system is actually what we're looking at as a new student resume, that sort of where students take responsibility for documenting their own growth and their own development in these arenas. So even within the context of personalization, we have redefined that to extensively focus on social emotional learning. Next slide. The core to our thinking is that the social curriculum is as important as the academic curriculum. What you see here is a morning meeting, and I'll talk more about that in a couple of minutes. But what we are trying to do is structure the social curriculum in a way that supports social skill development, that supports community building, that supports interaction of students in ways that cultivate and foster social skills and a positive social attitude and a sense of social responsibility. We've actually even taken that further and said, let's actually create a strategic plan around what that social curriculum will look like. What are the components of it, and how do we carry it forward? Next slide. The first component actually is looking at direct social skill instruction. We happen to use two programs, actually. One is Open Circle and the other is Second Step. But we believe that children need help to develop these social skills, and we focus primarily on empathy development and helping children become sensitive observers of others and the feeling states of others, helping them understand the causes of those feelings, and then really helping them respond in appropriate ways to those feelings and to resolve differences positively. So social skill instruction forms one of the major interventions for us, and that is system-wide. We use actually both those programs K to 8. We have some other social skill development in high school as well. Next slide. However, social skill development is just one element, and it needs to be complemented by the way we live in schools, that we have to actually create a sense of community in our classrooms and in our schools so that students see modeled the behaviors that we're encouraging them to develop, and they have the opportunity to resolve conflicts in the context of a learning community. So community building, and what I mean by that is that students experience being valued, influential contributors to a group that's dedicated to the learning and well-being of all members. Now, we do that through a whole variety of routines, one of which is we start primarily at the elementary level with morning meetings, which is a sort of a daily routine that builds community and a positive climate. But we also have class meetings where students discuss issues that have come up in the classroom or differences and how they might resolve those. We have closing meetings at the end of the day where students sort of come back as a community and debrief some of what happened during the day. We have school-wide activities, and we bring parents in a variety of ways so that they are deeply integrated into our community building and our community. So both social skill instruction and community building are key. But in addition, we need to take another step of seeing how are we teaching so that it reflects those concepts. So next slide. One of the areas that we're focused on is looking at how do we integrate social emotional learning into instruction. And one example I would offer is that we are in the development of an elementary social studies curriculum that integrates literacy and arts, but is grounded on a set of civic dispositions. And if you look through the list of civic dispositions that we've articulated, you can see the connection they have to social emotional learning: a commitment to social justice, individual responsibility, promotion of common good, open-mindedness, critical mindedness, compassion, negotiation, and compromise. They all fit into the CASEL framework in essence. And we look at each of the units as sort of exemplifying one or more of these civic dispositions. So that's just one of the ways we've taught this in social studies. It's also in science in terms of inquiry and posing questions and seeking understanding, or in math in terms of the dialogue that students have about a variety of answers and how to build on each other's thinking. We look at collaborative practices in the classroom to take model the ways we would like students to interact and ways that they could solve problems in learning together. And there's one final element, and that is that students need the opportunity to exhibit the skills that they are developing in the larger arena. So next slide. And that is, we believe strongly that service learning and community service are key elements of our plan to move social emotional learning forward. And there's many ways that students can be involved in service learning, intergenerational activities with senior citizens and working with our senior center. There's educational activities where, for example, we have buddy systems in all our elementary schools where fifth graders are partnered with second graders and fourth with first graders and third with kindergartners, and do collaborative reading and other activities that engage everyone in a learning experience and supportive learning. There can be environmental activities as these students are documenting the changes in a wetlands area. And actually, these students certified that area or worked to certify that area as a vernal pool. Humanitarian and in fact, political action. So there's a variety of ways of being involved. Next slide. In essence, what we have attempted to do is layer that in as an approach and look at it as a systemic approach, so that we're not just looking at it in a fragmentary way or one initiative, but saying, are we building a consistent systemic way of approaching this? So you'll see in social skill instruction, we look at second step and open circle. In terms of curricular integration, we have a lot of collaborative learning all the way through high school. We're looking at culture and literature to reflect the kinds of values and themes within social emotional learning and the literature we use, all the way up to a program called Facing History and Ourselves in the high school, which is it's really a Holocaust and genocide studies program that looks at individual responsibility and is a transformative curriculum. We also have an H block, which is an advisory program at the high school. And in fact, in terms of building community, we've used responsive classroom student councils. At the middle school, we have a program called Where Everybody Belongs, which is a 8th grades mentoring 6th graders, as well as advisory programs, and then service learning throughout. So you can get a sense that we've tried to strategically think through all the elements and how they cohere and work effectively together. So I'm going to transition this to Janet Robinson, who has done really extraordinary work in her district around social emotional learning. Janet?
Hi, thank you so much. I'm so pleased to have so many people tuning in today. I'm going to take a slightly different approach. You've heard some wonderful things about how well things are working, and I've thought I would outline for you a little bit of an approach or a process approach as we integrated social emotional learning in this district. As many of you have experienced, you often come into a district and you find, oh, here are all these things I would like to take on and tackle and make better. But there's so many that you want to make sure that you do this in some kind of coherent fashion that makes sense, and people can buy in and see that you're not just piling one more thing on what they're already so very busy doing. So what we thought about doing in this was to first start with bringing a group of stakeholders together from the community and from the faculty and the board and doing a strategic plan. If I could have the next slide, please. So what we did is we tried to bring together representatives of our community. Now, our community is highly diverse. We are 68% minority. We have 49 different languages. And so in bringing people together, we wanted to learn from them, and we wanted them to feel that they had some say in the school district's strategic plan. So what we brought together in the strategic plan, we worked to get people focused on really what is it we want and what is our mission and vision for the Stratford schools. So as you see up here, they constructed a new mission, and was really just getting through the mission part was such a process of bringing people together and understanding that they all really wanted the same things for their children. And the mission is to ensure that all students acquire the knowledge, character, and 21st century skills to succeed through high quality learning experiences and community partnerships within a culture of diversity and respect. And one of the things that was a quality of the community already was a great deal of partnership between community people and the schools and some of our businesses. So we wanted to really capitalize on that. So as we went through the process, we outlined 4 strands. There were 4 goals that became 4 strands. One is 21st century skills. The other, mastery-based learning, social emotional learning, and family community partnerships. So in terms of working on those, then we involved committees that would focus on each one of those strands. We had over 100 people working on committees. The first one, which was the 21st century, is cross-curricular, and also we paired these up so that you can see there was crossover between the 21st century skills and mastery-based learning. Crossover existed between social emotional learning and our family community partnerships. So as these teams began to work and looking at what we needed to deal with, we saw so much of what involved 21st century were habits of work, and we needed to look at those and define those. It was so wonderful for the community people to really begin to have an awareness of how those habits of work in school also translated into future habits of work when these students became out in the workforce and needing to be employed. So the work evolved over several years. And as you can see by this color-coded chart, you can see that some of these things have been done already, and some of them will be done in the future. As we started, we put a lot of emphasis on 21st century skills and mastery-based learning, seeing that those were really good basis for future work on SEL. But meanwhile, our SEL committee was one of the most enthusiastic committees you've seen work. So as these were meeting together, coming together and sharing the work, we began to see how habits of work and social emotional learning all overlapped. And even though we were working a little slower on the social emotional learning, the enthusiasm of the people working on this helped us get some things moving along very quickly. So you can see what we have on the left side of your screen, which indicates all the things we've been doing, and that has emerged into now in 1920. We've been doing assessments and supports, and I actually have changed report cards and other things that support the work that they've been doing. And by the way, it was not difficult to keep these community members engaged. We started this work in 2017, and the same people are continuing to meet and work and report back to the group with a great deal of enthusiasm. In the social emotional learning, the enthusiasm of the group was so incredible. They began immediately researching what was going on around the country and finding things such as the CASEL website that was very helpful. Their enthusiasm in a way which as a superintendent I supported and I listened to, but in a way it sort of had us jump a couple steps. If you remember back a few of the screens ago, CASEL introduced their district framework with 4 focus areas. The first one being build foundational support and planning, and number 2 was strengthen adult SEL competencies and capacity, and number 3 was promote SEL for students. Our folks were so enthusiastic, they jumped right into 3. They wanted to do everything they could. They saw all the value for social emotional learning, and they wanted to bring all these wonderful things to our students right away. And the basis of their foundational support was really taking a look at the standards that they felt would be important to in the future integrate into the curricular areas. And they did research and develop some standards. but they wanted to see these wonderful things happen with students. And so they began introducing the kinds of things like responsive classroom, restorative practice, trauma-sensitive classrooms in schools. They began doing these things that would be really so wonderful for students. One of the things we did fail to do was focus area number 2. We didn't spend enough time strengthening the adult SEL competencies and capacities. And in order to have the consistency throughout our 14 schools, we needed to step back and really make sure our adults were understanding this wasn't just having the responsive classroom circles in the morning. It wasn't just having a restorative practice when 2 students were having a disagreement. It was really about the language that the adults used throughout the day and the way they handled any area of feeling. And many of the adults were struggling to be comfortable with SEL. My wake-up call is when I had a teacher say to me, I am here to teach social studies. I know social studies. I'm comfortable with social studies. I am not a counselor. And with that in mind, we stepped back and said, we have overlooked a full development of strengthening our adult SEL competencies, and we need to change that. So if right now, that's kind of where we are going. We are now doing much more training and professional development for the adults in the SEL realm. And that is embracing, it isn't negating any of the work we've done so far, but it is helping facilitate how we are going to embrace SEL more thoroughly and be able to have some level of coherence throughout the district. So with that, we've been working hard to really begin to do more and more with our staff. To me, the most important thing is for them to understand the why. And the why was indicated by our community in this strategic plan, but more closely, all of our staff need to understand the why in terms of why it benefited their relationships with students and therefore benefited our students. And that piece is our focus of what we're doing right now. And we have really developed some very nice things that we'll be doing that are very similar to what you just saw from Sheldon, but it took us a little more circuitous route to get there. And that's what we've been working on. So with that, I'm sharing our journey as we begin working with this. In hopefully what we will see as outcomes is we will see more and more of the kind of dialogue that goes on in the classroom that is, even in the academic, a dialogue that's very sensitive to the needs of our students, and keeping in mind that many of our students come from poverty areas. Our classrooms have to be the safe place for those students. So I'm turning this back over to who's next.
Thank you, Janet. I think we are at the end of our actual content, so we'll definitely be open for questions. Unless you and Sheldon wanted to share some of the lessons learned. I know you did just share a big one about the adult SEL, but Sheldon, I don't know if you want to chime back in with some of the lessons learned from your district, and then we can go to some questions.
Sure. There were a number of things that I've learned in the implementation of this and in the districts I've been involved in over the last 27 years. The first is, and I think it stood out in Janet's presentation and in what I tried to articulate, and that is that consistent planning is key, and it requires as consistent planning as we do with the academic curriculum. It requires thinking through how you're going to set goals, how you're going to achieve those goals, and putting in place, much as you saw in Janet's, bringing stakeholders together and then having a sort of a sequence of how you're going to implement it. A second lesson that I've learned is just modeling by adults is really essential, and that requires high quality professional development that both enables teachers to teach social emotional skills, but it also helps them address how to deal with conflicts or how to deal with situations in a different way. I think one of the keys is to understand our own biases and perspective, and in that area, building that sense of community in a classroom is a talent. How you bring a group together, how you facilitate that group, and that requires the kinds of professional development that I think are essential to move this forward. As part of that building of community, one of the other lessons that I've learned is that you have to bring culture into it. Students have to see that their culture is accepted in the classroom, and that there's a cultural authenticity in the classroom. So there's a lot of consistency between culturally responsive practice and social emotional learning. Another insight that I've had is how we discipline students either fosters or undermines social emotional learning goals. In essence, are we thinking of this as punishment versus are we thinking of this as a learning opportunity for students? And are we thinking of, when there is a conflict, that the key is restoring the relationships and building the relationships through conflict, or as they work through conflict. And then back to the one that I started with, is that administrative vision and leadership are critical. It's key that we continue to foster the directions that we see as important, but it's clear that we have to take up stands in a position and articulate how important this is as a key element in our work moving forward.
Thank you.
Can I just add to Sheldon? I underscore what he said in particular about the cultural aspect and also the issue around discipline. So often a student is disciplined by a teacher and has this sense that the teacher doesn't like me now because I did something that I wasn't supposed to do. And I think too often when it occurs, that we don't take the time to, as administrators, we don't take the time to facilitate a reentry for the student, so that the teacher and the student reestablish a relationship, so that the student understands that a discipline issue doesn't destroy the relationship between the two of them.
That's an excellent point. Thank you for sharing that, Janet, and thank you for your insights as well, Sheldon. I'm going to give both of you and Justina just a minute to catch your breath, and thank you, of course, for sharing all this information. To remind folks that you will get an email tomorrow with a link to the recording and to the slide deck, so you can review everything again, listen to that video if the audio wasn't clear, and we encourage you to share this information with your colleagues. And then just quickly, before we get to the rest of the Q&A, I would like to thank CASEL and AASA for bringing everyone together today. And I'd also like to invite you to join CASEL and many SEL leaders in October at the second SEL Exchange Conference. Last year's inaugural event brought together 2,000 people to learn and share about SEL, and this year's event is planned for October 14th through 16th in the Chicagoland area. There'll also be a pre-conference event on October 13th. So CASEL's very much in the planning of this and in the thick of things in terms of getting the agenda together, and we'll start to be releasing that information here over the next several months. So you can learn more about the conference at selexchange.casel.org. And while you're on the conference site, if you haven't already, be sure to sign up to receive email notifications about the conference so that you can keep in touch with what's going on with that. And we hope you'll be able to join us. All right, let's go ahead to some of the questions that have come in. So we did get a lot of questions around, for both Sheldon and you, Janet, that your visions are very comprehensive and impressive, and some questions around wondering how you're measuring the success of achieving those visions.
I can begin. Well, first of all, we look at implementation and the quality of implementation and the support for implementation. And that we've done with we have program coordinators who are in curricular programs that are looking at the integration of social emotional learning into the curriculum. We've done a lot of work with our administrators in terms of their leadership in social emotional learning and looking at implementation. But the way we have begun to assess this is actually we use a survey called the Panorama Survey. Panorama Education puts out a number of scales that we have used that really focus around the sense of connectedness to school. And so we administer the survey actually once a year in all our schools, and then we have data meetings around the data with our teachers, and our administrators have data meetings around what that tells us, what can we do to address differences that we see or growth that we see, and how can we further build that sense of connectedness to school. So that's been our primary strategy. There are some, the state of Massachusetts actually has a survey that they do as part of our MCAS testing that looks at culture and climate in schools. And so we have used that in addition to the Panorama survey to give us a sense of how our students perceive the culture and climate of the schools. So those are the core of how we're doing assessment.
Yes, and I would echo the Panorama has been very helpful. In the beginning, as we began the implementation, we gathered some data from the Panorama surveys, but we also were looking to see the evidence of these skills being implemented within the classrooms. So we did some instructional rounds that were totally focused on seeing the evidence of SEL within the classrooms. And that was an interesting conversation after we did each of those, because it was rich, and it was also a great conversation for our principals, all the principals in the district engaged in these, to talk to one another about the aha experiences, the epiphanies they had as they saw it within one classroom and maybe not in another, and what were those differences. And then we have been doing the Panorama surveys for about 7 years now, the same as Sheldon has. The other thing that we are looking at is we are looking at our school attendance. Our chronic absenteeism was quite a problem 7 years ago. And so we are looking at how the differences that are taking place in each of the schools now, and that has been just steadily coming down. We've been looking at the expulsion rate, which has dropped significantly, referrals to the office, which is the biggest drop right there. And our graduation rate at both our high schools now is in the high 90s. So those are the kinds of things that we want to always be looking for to see what kind of data can we show to our community that this work they put in is really coming to fruition, and it's good for our kids.
That's wonderful stats that you're sharing there, Janet. And we did get some questions specifically around that, so thanks for addressing them. Justina, maybe you want to start us off on this, and then I'm sure Sheldon and Janet can jump in as well. We have this attendee has implemented a pilot SEL program at one middle school, and during the implementation, we learned the necessity to help our adults with social and emotional health. As Janet, you mentioned, we learned that several of our adults were dealing personally with SEL issues. Are there resources available to help staff deal with their own SEL health?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll share a couple things that are available for free on our website that can help you get started. And then, yes, I'd love to hear Sheldon and Janet share what they've done at their districts as well. So both our Castle District Resource Center and School Guide have a number of resources around how to strengthen adult SEL competencies and capacity. And this really focuses on a couple different things. One is engaging adults in opportunities to reflect on their own social emotional competencies and kind of begin to understand how their SEL comes into play in the school, how it comes into play with their relationships with their colleagues or with their students. So I think that's one critical step that you can take. There's a number of tools and resources that you can integrate into professional learning or into staff meetings that's available at schoolguide.castle.org. The other piece I think that's really important is in order for adults to be able to engage in this work, we've found that it's really critically important that they have a community, a sense of community among staff, a way of kind of being in relation with each other and working together. So there's again a number of different resources that can help you do this. One thing in particular, Castle has kind of a resource booklet called 3 Signature Practices that again is available at DRC or the School Guide that helps adults within professional learning or meetings just take time to be able to build those connections, relate to one another, reflect on their work together. And then thirdly, I think it's really important as adults are thinking about this work with children to think about how they're modeling SEL, either as leaders in organizations, especially in the superintendency role, or even as classroom teachers to students. And so I think a couple things, there's ways to kind of engage adults in professional learning around planning how to model SEL and thinking about strategies that schools can take and districts can take to be able to create the culture that lets this happen. So again, all these resources are available for free online. And the last thing I'll say is if there are kind of specifically stress-related issues, there are also links to specific adult SEL programs that you could choose to bring into your school that help adults kind of reflect on their level of stress, practice different things to kind of reduce that and address those issues within schools and districts.
Okay, that's excellent. Excellent. If I can just pick up on what Justine has just said, we've used so much off of Castle. It's been very helpful. And what we've done is because we love the fact that we have develop a community spirit as a district, but we understand the importance of having a family community spirit at the building level. So our administrators at every building have been doing ongoing book studies, which gives people the opportunity to read some things and discuss in a little more intimate atmosphere than the kinds of things that might happen district-wide. And in the course of reading the book Permission to Feel from Mark Brackett, so many things have come out in terms of conversations of teachers having some sort of realization that they were uncomfortable even recognizing their own feelings. So their ability to really understand the feelings of a student in the classroom were difficult for them because they couldn't put their own feelings into words. And that discussion in every one of the schools has been very, very rich. And so with those resources and using the book study model, it's been very helpful. It really hit me in terms of a realization of how we have to focus on our adults. When we were doing some trauma sensitive training around what kids are going through and the risks and trauma that many of them have been through. And a teacher had to walk out because so much of what was being talked about was taking her back to the trauma she had experienced as a child. And so it really sensitizes us to what we need to do to pay attention to the feelings of teachers, help those who've kind of felt like it wasn't okay to do feeling kinds of things, and give them permission to feel okay about things or feel troubled about something and be able to express it, and it's okay.
Yeah, excellent points, Janet. And I think we've had so many questions around the adult component of SEL. It clearly is one of the many places that needs to be addressed when you're rolling out these programs across the district. So thank you, Justina, for sharing all of those resources. That's a great starting place for folks. Let's see if we can get in one or two more questions. We've had some questions around culturally responsive and equity focused SEL and how that's being merged into SEL, particularly again at the adult level. So Janet and Sheldon or Justina, do you have suggestions on or examples of how you're doing this in your in-service and coaching professional development for your teams?
Well, I can respond initially, and I think probably this is a question that all of us want to respond to. I think equity is a really important issue, and I believe that frankly, equity is at the heart of social emotional learning. You can't do social emotional learning without being present and valuing every student who is in the classroom, and so bringing, as I said when I was speaking, the bringing a student's cultural identity into the classroom and recognizing that, and having all students bring their cultural background in, and being straightforward about that, and creating an identity safe space in classrooms and schools is absolutely critical. And the only way you get to do that is through effective social emotional learning. It sets the context for it, it sets the supports for it, and it is so they're deeply culturally responsive practices and social emotional learning are deeply intertwined. Creating an environment where you have a diverse community and supporting a diverse community and seeing the richness that diversity brings is essential as part of our work in social emotional learning. So I think that both of them are very compatible and aligned. And in that way, it sort of brings, it creates an equitable classroom where all students can be present, all students are known and valued, and you focus on student assets rather than their deficits. So getting to that level is a shift for teachers and for administrators as well, and it's important that we see how that shift takes place and support teachers in helping them understand the alignment between culturally responsive practices and social emotional learning.
I agree with you so much, Sheldon. We can't possibly have anything but superficial social emotional learning if it doesn't integrate throughout equity. I felt so strongly about that we looked at equity training is something we wanted to do very intentionally. So we did some work on implicit bias, and that was very, very hard for some people. But it really caused some very frank conversations and really made people realize how those kinds of preconceived notions that are there about people just because of skin color or origin or other types of things. And that was, I think, one of the, that was a hurdle, but it was like the thing that jump-started us also in terms of our seeing social emotional learning really take off for teachers. The adult behavior and attitudes and mindsets really had to be awakened so that they could change and welcome all students.
Justina, did you want to chime in with any last thoughts?
I think Shelley and Janet said it all. The only other piece that I will add, in addition to thinking about kind of students' assets and voice and the adults as well, is I think a critical component as we think about SEL in service of equity is thinking about how we leverage families and communities into the conversation as well. particularly if they have, not felt as included within district strategic plans or visions, et cetera. I think the example that Janet gave of how they had really reached out across the community towards developing their strategic plan kind of really speaks to how you can integrate that component in. So just thank you, Sheldon and Janet, for all your work on this.
Well, you're welcome.
It's our pleasure.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing all you've been doing in your districts. I think it helps provide great examples and a roadmap for everyone who joined us today. And we have unfortunately reached the end of our time. I know we could all go on talking for many more hours about this topic, but we appreciate Justina, Sheldon, and Janet for joining us today, and again sharing their expertise and insights. And we will be sending you a copy of the slide deck as well as the recording. Just keep an eye on your inbox for that tomorrow. And again, feel free to share that with your colleagues and continue the conversations in your own districts as you work through your own SEL implementations. Also, just before you log off the webinar, you'll be prompted to take a quick survey, and we would really appreciate it if you would take just a minute, and it's probably less than a minute, to answer the questions. Your responses really help us to continue to improve these webinars and also to plan webinar programming that is of best interest to you. So please take a moment to do that. We really appreciate it. Thanks again, everyone, for joining us, and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you. Are we still on?
We are. I'm just logging us off.
Okay.